Welcome to Catholic Theological Union. I'm Sister Barbara Reed, President of CTU, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this year's Winter Shapiro Lecture. The Catholic Jewish Studies program at CTU hosts 3 Shapiro lectures each year, made possible through the generosity of the Shapiro Family Foundation. For many decades, they have enabled CTU to invite world-renowned scholars to speak on a range of topics related to theology, current issues, and culture. For those of you who may be new to CTU, we were founded in 1968 in the wake of the Second Vatican Council, which issued the groundbreaking document Nostra Aetate, the Declaration on the Relation of the Church with Non-Christian Religions. Since our founding, CTU has been very committed to interreligious dialogue, especially through our Catholic Jewish Studies and Catholic Muslim Studies programs. We are grateful for the leadership of Father John Polakowski and Rabbi Chaim Perlmutter of blessed memory, 2 of our founding faculty members who established the Catholic Jewish Studies program and who launched the deep and lasting friendships that have been formed between CTU and our Jewish partners in the last 5+ decades. Dr. Isaac Oliver has been coordinating the Catholic Jewish Studies program on an interim basis this academic year, and I invite him now to introduce our esteemed guest lecturer.
It's my pleasure and honor to welcome Rabbi Shai Held, one of the most influential Jewish thinkers and leaders in America, who is president and dean of the Hadar Institute in New York City. Rabbi Held received the prestigious Covenant Award for Excellence in Jewish Education and has been named multiple times to Newsweek's list of the most influential rabbis in America, as well as to the Forward's list of the most prominent Jews in the world. He is the author of Abraham Joshua Heschel, The Call of Transcendence, and The Heart of Torah, Essays on the Weekly Torah Portion. His new book, Judaism is About Love, has just been published and explains the title of his presentation for this evening's lecture, Do Jews and Christians Love the Same Way? On a personal note, I'd like to add that I have devoured many of Rabbi Held's lectures that I have heard on the website of the Hadar Institute. Some of them are open access, and I highly recommend.
Thank you so much, Isaac. Thank you to all of you, and thank you to CTU for your virtual hospitality. It's really an honor to give this presentation. So let me just begin by saying a couple of sentences about what I want to do, and then I'll set about doing it. I want to share a little bit about why I felt the need and almost the obligation, at the risk of sounding grandiose, to write a book like Judaism is About Love, and then to take a deep dive into some of the ways I think that Jews and Christians tend to think about love somewhat differently. This book, in a sense, emerged from 2 experiences that I had, one of which I write about in the opening pages of this book, and one of which I regret that I didn't write about, but that I think I probably should have. The first experience, which was really enormously formative for me, took place probably 25 years ago. I was speaking to a group of senior rabbinical students at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, and in the middle of a presentation about something totally unrelated, I said something that I thought at the time was completely uncontroversial. I said, Judaism is the story of a God who loves us and beckons us to love God back. To which one of the students responded, much more sneeringly, I have to say, than I report in the book, I'm sorry, but that just sounds like Christianity to me. And I was completely crestfallen, shocked actually, but also kind of heartbroken. And I said to him, it is really interesting to me and really sad that I say that, and the first thing you think of is Christianity, because in fact, I was thinking of the twice-a-day Jewish liturgy in which we say, with vast love have you, God, loved us, and then immediately recite Deuteronomy chapter 6, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your being and all your might. In other words, a God who loves us and beckons us to love God back. So if you hear that and you think that sounds like Christianity, then there is a much more fundamental and difficult conversation we need to have about how and why it is that so many Jews, including knowledgeable, passionate Jews, 50 rabbinical students at a major rabbinical seminary, how deeply we have internalized a traditional Christian anti-Judaic bias. We have to talk about that because it runs very, very deep. You know, the historian David Nirenberg talks about how Christianity told a story about the world according to which Judaism was a loveless religion and Christianity came into the world to bring what was absent, to fill the lacuna, if you will. And the thing that is so striking to me, and I've seen this again and again and again over almost 3 decades now, is that this is an internalized prejudice that cuts across Jewish denominational lines. I've had Reform Jews say this to me, conservative rabbis say this to me, Orthodox yeshiva students in Israel say it runs very, very deep. And I'll just note, we know from social science that minority communities often internalize the way majority communities see them. And Jews have been religiously a minority community for 2,000 years. It is not so surprising that so many Jews have internalized what at the end of the day is a kind of Christian caricature. Now, I'll just add as a footnote to this that there's another dimension here, which is that at a certain point in American Jewish history, American Jews who were anxious about assimilation and not that knowledgeable about Judaism, I think began consciously or unconsciously, I'm not sure, but they began to define Judaism as whatever they thought Christianity was not. So the most famous example of this is that American Jewish children were taught for generations that Judaism has no notion of the afterlife, which, if you know anything about Jewish sources, is a completely absurd claim. But American Jews who also did not have a sophisticated understanding of Christianity basically thought, oh, Christianity, that's all about getting into heaven. We don't even believe in heaven. And in a similar way, if Christianity is all about love, we must be all about something else. And so what happened to American Judaism is what I like to call a kind of double whammy. On the one hand, the majority culture consistently told the Jews that they had a loveless religion. And at the same time, the Jews who were anxious about separating themselves, distinguishing themselves from Christianity, repeated the same extremely problematic canard. And hence you have this problem of 50-year rabbinical students with this internalized bias. And so this project for me, first and foremost, is about trying to help Jews see Judaism on its own terms, apart from the withering gaze of anti-Judaic caricature. But there's another dimension, as I suggested, which is, and I wish I had written about this, is that actually only a few months later after that event with a rabbinical student, I was speaking at a conference, an interfaith conference of high school students, and I was in a room with a group of 20 Protestant teenagers. This tells you how long ago it was. Protestant was still like a meaningful way of breaking up the students. And I'm talking to these students, and again, it's not the main topic, but I say to the kids in passing, so guys, tell me, what does Jesus say is the great command? And all of them raise their hand. I call on them. I call on one of them, and he says very proudly, love of God and love of neighbor. And then totally innocently, I add, and guys, remind me, what is Jesus quoting? And not a single hand goes up. Not a single hand goes up. The answer, of course, is Leviticus and Deuteronomy. I found this stunning. And I thought to myself, so this is how a culture is able to perpetuate a caricatured view of another culture. None of you kids have been taught where Jesus got the love from. None of you know what wells Jesus drank from. I'm not disappointed in you, you're kids, but your teachers have done something enormously problematic. And so the second audience for this book is Christians. Christians who are open to, receptive to, in some cases eager to put down stereotypes and caricatures of the Jewish tradition that are obsolete at best and deeply, deeply offensive at worst. That's the sort of project that animated me here and that drove me to this work. Now, to shift to tonight's real topic, the danger that I felt in working on this is that I needed to make clear that if both Judaism and Christianity are, as I'm arguing, religions of love, it's important to emphasize that Judaism is not just Christianity avant la lettre, right? Jews are not just Christians before they were Christians. Jews are someone else. Now, there are obvious and fundamental differences. I don't have to tell you. Some would say chasms between Jewish theology and Christians. Either Jesus is or is not the Messiah. Either Jesus is or is not the Son of God. Either God was incarnate in Jesus Christ or God was not. Either the God of the universe is a Trinity or God is not. Those are kind of like obvious fundamental theological divides. But what I have in mind is something else, which is that even when it comes to approaches to love in particular, there are crucial differences to think about. And I think this point is really critical. Real interfaith conversation is not, and in any case, certainly not only about people getting together to be polite to one another. It is also about genuinely respectful but real, open-hearted conversation about significant religious, theological, spiritual, ethical differences. So with that in mind, I want to talk about some key differences in the ways Jews and Christians tend to talk about love. And I say tend to because obviously all religious traditions are vast and variegated. Both Judaism and Christianity say many different things about most issues. And yet, on many issues, I do think there are broad thrusts that we can coherently talk about where Judaism and Christianity differ. And I want to mention 4 in particular. 1 is around the question of law. 2 is about the question of the particular and the universal. 3 is about different approaches to love of enemies, even though that distinction is not as stark as people often suggest. And then 4th and finally, but only very briefly, different approaches to human nature, and therefore to the question of how much love we are capable of. So let me begin with law. We often hear it said, I think both by Jews and by Christians, that whereas Christianity is about love, Judaism is about law. But here is the key point. Judaism is in fact about law, but for Judaism, law is a manifestation of love, not an alternative to it. To say about Judaism that it is about law rather than love is to fundamentally and completely misunderstand the function of law in Jewish theology and spirituality. In our daily prayer, the same one I alluded to in talking to that rabbinical student, in the evenings we say to God, with everlasting love have you loved your people, the house of Israel, and then immediately add, you have taught us Torah and commandments, decrees and laws of justice. That is to say, God, you expressed your love for us by giving us these mitzvot, these commandments. And Deuteronomy already underscores again and again that the law is given litovlach, for your own flourishing, something that in Christian circles, the Bible scholar Terence Fredheim underscored again and again in recent times. I often think about this. This is an imperfect metaphor, but it is how I think about it. It's almost as if God were a parent whose kids are leaving for college. And you sit down your kid before they leave for college and you say, wait, before you go, there's actually a bunch of things I want to tell you. Make sure you know when you go out into the world so that you can actually live in a flourishing way. That's in a way how the rabbis understood, one of the ways the rabbis of the Talmud understood the divine law. And indeed, observance of the law, shmirat hamitzvot, in Jewish thought is, among other things, an opportunity for intimacy with God. So much so that later Kabbalists actually playfully derived the word mitzvah in Hebrew, that derived from the Hebrew root for command. They derive it from the Aramaic root for companionship, savta, right? Mitzvot are opportunities for intimacy. The idea of intimacy conveyed through commandments, both God's giving them as a gesture of intimacy and our observing them as a reciprocal gesture of intimacy, I think may strike many Christians as strange or even bizarre. So consider, for example, and yes, I do realize that this is a Catholic seminary, but consider, for example, the words of Martin Luther. This is Luther in his lecture on Galatians. This is a passage that for a Jew is utterly incomprehensible internally. Quote, the law is a taskmaster. It demands that we work and that we give. In short, it wants to have something from us. The gospel, on the contrary, does not demand. It grants freely. It commands us to hold out our hands and to receive what is being offered. Now, demanding and granting, receiving and offering are exact opposites and cannot exist together. My point is simply that the contrast Luther draws between law and gospel sounds utterly alien to observant Jews. Needless to say, we don't recognize our Judaism in Luther's complaints about the law. So far from seeing the law as a burden that brings us up against our own inadequacy, Jews traditionally experience the law as a delight that reflects God's concern for our own well-being and respect for our agency. And let me just underscore that last point. God commands those whose agency God takes seriously. The law is a sign of respect. Accordingly, a core part of Jewish spirituality is what is called in rabbinic idiom the joy of the commandments, or I'm tempted to even say the joy of being commanded, simcha shel mitzvah. Let me put this point differently at the risk of belaboring it. The legal historian Joseph David writes that for Luther, and I'm going to quote here, legalism, or being under the law, is the most colossal religious mistake against which Christianity appeared to redeem humanity. For Jews, in contrast, the law is a gift, an ever-present token of God's love and closeness. If read closely, I think, Deuteronomy already gives powerful expression to this sense that love and commandment are deeply intertwined. Deuteronomy asks a pair of rhetorical questions that we rarely stop to consider the relationship between. So listen to this for a minute. Question number 1. For what great nation is there that has its God so close at hand, as is the Lord our God, whenever we call upon God? And now question number 2, immediately following. Or what great nation has laws and rules as righteous as all this teaching that I set before you this day? This is Deuteronomy chapter 4. The connection between these two rhetorical questions might seem elusive at first, but to Jews, I think it is highly intuitive and perhaps even obvious. God's presence is manifest to us in part through the commandments and laws that God has given us. Before I leave this subject, I want to add a complicating caveat. I recognize that obviously not all Christians are Lutherans, and that not all Christian thinkers approach the law as negatively as Luther does. I've chosen to discuss Luther's approach because sometimes exploring the most extreme articulations within a tradition helps us draw out and thus better understand where we differ. But I am open to the criticism and the challenge that the portrayal of Christianity in my book may at times sound simply too Lutheran. Someone like John Wesley, for example, had a much more appreciative sense of the law than Luther. Just to sort of play this out for a second, listen to Wesley for a minute. Let the law always prepare for the gospel. On the one hand, the law continually makes way for and points us to the gospel. On the other, the gospel continually leads us to a more exact fulfilling of the law. Martin Luther, I think, would have been bewildered and even appalled by what Wesley says here. And yet, and I know I'm still talking about Protestants in a Catholic seminary, but and yet, even for Wesley, the first purpose of the law is to show, quote, to convict sinners. And the law is also a term from Wesley, a killing ordinance. Even though so much more moderate than Luther, this is still miles away from anything a Jew could possibly recognize. As for the ways Catholic approaches to law may differ from both Luther and Wesley, I know I have more to learn and think through. I will say that from my conversations with various Catholic theologians about this topic seems enormously elusive even to Catholics themselves, if I may be so bold. Okay, that's piece number 1. Number 2, around the particular and the universal. Speaking very broadly, and here I'm going to quote with minor variation one paragraph from Judaism is About Love. I will do that a couple of other times here where I found the formulations I came up with in preparing this lecture not as clear as the ones in the book. Jewish thought embraces a dialectical vision of love. Jewish ethics allows us, indeed it requires us, to prioritize concern for those near and dear to us over concern for those who are more distant, whether relationally or geographically. But at the same time, Jewish ethics demands that we not stop there. Family first is decidedly not, must not be allowed to devolve into family only. And more, on the one hand, the mandate to love our neighbor refers to love of fellow Jews. Yet on the other hand, the fact that all humans are created in the image of God means that Jews are also obligated to love all humanity. When it comes to the question of the particular or the universal, Judaism's answer is profoundly yes. The summons, therefore, in other words, is clear, if also more than a little daunting. Love for the near and the distant, love for one's own people, and love for humanity as a whole. In other words, Jewish ethics has always recognized the permissibility. Indeed, you might say the desirability. More than that, you might say the necessity of partiality in ethics. Partiality in the sense, of course, of being partial to some people over others. I may be obligated to respond to your children when they are in need, but I have a greater obligation to respond to my own children when they are. In any case, Jewish law and most people's moral intuitions insist that my obligations to my own children take precedence over my obligation to yours. Again, and at the risk of belaboring this point, we are not permitted to ignore or be indifferent to the needs of other people's children, but we act rightly when we put our own children's needs first. Now, this point may be obvious to the point of self-explanatory to many people, but crucially, not all philosophers and theologians agree. Some, though not all, utilitarians, for example, would argue that since everyone counts equally, thinking ethically requires us to weigh up all the interests of all people affected by our decision and to do whatever maximizes the interests of all the parties affected. As they see it, there is no defensible way to prioritize my children over anyone else's. To take the most extreme example I know of, in a recent book, Peter Singer admits that vanishingly few, if any, parents would give away their last bowl of rice while their own child was starving, but he insists perhaps they should. I will leave that without comment, although I think that is sort of a morally extraordinarily bizarre position to take. But my interest here obviously is not in utilitarianism, but in Christianity. So let me observe the following. In one of the most influential books of modern Christian ethics, the philosopher Jean Utka argues that agape, or Christian love, ought to be understood as what he calls, quote, equal regard. The primary characteristic of Christian love, he says, is impartial respect for all human beings. He does try to make space for personal relationships, but as the Catholic ethicist Stephen Pope, for example, argues, Utka's vision of agape, and I'll quote Pope here, does not sufficiently appreciate the moral significance of the kind of love that is part of ordinary human life. And that, in particular, is marked by special degrees of affection, loyalty, and moral obligation. In other words, Christian thinkers are divided. Some see the ideal as non-preferential equal regard, while others insist that the partial nature of love reflects the divine will. One might even argue, I am out of my zone of expertise here, but in private exchanges with me, Pope has insisted on precisely this, that this is at least in part a Catholic-Lutheran divide. Whereas at least some Lutherans, like Utka and Kierkegaard before him, advocate for impartiality, Catholics, who are heirs to Aquinas' commitment to the Ordo Amoris, are far less ambivalent about embracing partiality. In any event, the kind of debate we find among Christian writers is alien to the Jewish tradition. As we've seen, Jewish ethics never really doubts the priority of special relations. That family, friends, and neighbors come first is not really in question. I think this stems from a foundational theological and ethical principle. In the words of the Talmud, the Blessed Holy One does not deal imperiously, betirunia, with God's creations. The idea there, I think, is that God does not make demands that are impossible for human beings to fulfill, or better, more sophisticated formulation of this, Jewish ethics always works with the grain of nature rather than against it. But I want to push deeper. Christian thinkers in general are quicker than Jewish ones to leap to the universal. And in a Christian society, it can be tempting to assume that universalism is always and everywhere superior to particularism. That is an unexamined assumption in many ways in American society that Jews are susceptible to, but in fact, the world is far more complicated than that simple idea would suggest. Because, historically speaking, universalism went hand in hand with imperialism. We care about everyone, and we will convince, that is, force them to live in the best possible way, that is, our way. History is littered with the corpses of universalism run amok. Jews are much slower to embrace universalism, not least because Jews have so often been its victims. In the eyes of historical Christianity, one of the Jews' greatest sins was our stubborn adherence to our own particularity. If you ever heard people talk about Jews as clannish, that's just an explicitly anti-Semitic of an implicitly anti-Judaic idea. Now, to be sure, because my point here is anything but interreligious polemic, it's actually interreligious understanding, particularism too has its limits. Particularists often limit their horizon. They focus on their own and leave other people to take care of themselves. So again, my point is not to argue for the superiority of either particularism or universalism, but to be honest about the trade-offs we are forced to make in embracing one or the other. To put the issue somewhat crudely, Judaism has always excelled at leaving other people alone, but it has sometimes tended to forget that other people matter. Christianity, in contrast, has always remembered that other people matter, but it took Christians almost 2,000 years to consider the very possibility of leaving anyone alone. The ideal, we might say, is to combine the best of what particularism and universalism have to offer and have to demand of us. We care about everyone, but we start local and we allow other people to be who they are. That is the dialectic that Jewish ethics at its best, I think, seeks to express. Third, love of enemies. This too, I think, in our culture is almost a truism. Christianity teaches us to love our enemies, whereas Judaism, and now you can fill in various blanks. Here's some versions that I've heard. Christianity teaches us to love our enemies, whereas Judaism teaches us not to be naive. Christianity teaches us to love our enemies, whereas Judaism insists on the obligation to defend ourselves and the obligation to defend the vulnerable, and so on, whatever it might be. But this is always presented as Christianity says X and Judaism says Y. So here I'll speak very personally about an experience that I had that was kind of like revelatory for me. I was reading a whole bunch of Christian ethicists and New Testament scholars on love of enemies, and one of the things I noted was that so many of them assumed, asserted, insisted that love of enemies is the very core of Jesus's teaching. But as soon as it came to explaining what love of enemies actually consists of, there was endless debate. If I were being a little disrespectful, I might say Christians love to fight about what love of enemies consists of. So I sat down, took out a pad, and started making a list. What are the things that I have seen Christian writers say love of enemies require? And then looking at the list, I noticed something striking. Almost every item on that list is well attested in biblical and rabbinic tradition also. So I'll give you just a couple of examples. Just to get us going, the ethos of non-retaliation. When someone hurts you, don't hurt them back. Here's the thing. 3 times a day, Jews conclude the Amida prayer, the central prayer of Jewish liturgy, by praying, V'lemekalelai nafshi tidom, and to those who curse me, may my soul remain silent. And the Talmud praises those who, quote, are insulted and do not insult, who hear themselves shamed and do not respond. Another example, the refusal of vengeance. Leviticus, of course, instructs us not to take vengeance and bear a grudge against those who hurt us. It's Leviticus 19, the same verses that teach us about loving our neighbor. Proverbs underscores the prohibition. Do not say, I will requite evil. Put your hope in the Lord, and the Lord will deliver you. I'm going to just throw the following thing out. I have this thought of writing an essay about something I'm not really qualified to write, but about how much of Jesus' teaching, when I read it as a Jew, seems to be a riff on Proverbs in the book of Proverbs. Gospels as a reading of Mishlei, but that's a topic for another day or for the Q&A. What we have here is a kind of golden rule in reverse. Don't do unto others what they have done unto you. Third example, the refusal of Schadenfreude. Proverbs, if your enemy falls, do not rejoice. If he trips, let your heart not exult, lest the Lord see it and be displeased and avert his wrath from him. Or, as the Midrash astonishingly tells us, we only recite some of the chapters of Psalms for joy of celebration on Passover, because after all, the Egyptians died and we limit our joy. A fourth example, showing kindness to enemies. The book of Proverbs. If your enemy is hungry, give him bread to eat. If he is thirsty, give him water to drink. And in one of the most astonishing passages in Midrashic literature, the Midrash on Proverbs says, if your enemy comes to your home with the intention of killing you, but is hungry when he gets there, give him food. So, what all of this amounts to is that a lot of what Christian thinkers tend to categorize as love of enemies is required by Jewish ethics too, even if it is very rarely placed under a heading called love of enemies. But the content is actually to a very significant degree overlapping. So if that's right, then where is there disagreement between Judaism and Christianity on this question? And here I would say two core things. First, one of the things I was struck by in trying to write about love of enemies in my book is that I think we use the word enemies to mean such a spectacularly diverse array of people that the term almost becomes devoid of meaning. I'll give you a couple of examples of what I mean. Enemies. The guy at work I really don't get along with. We're very competitive. We don't really like each other very much. 2, my cousin Zelda. We were in business together, and I really had questions about how she managed the finances. Deep down, I kind of think she's a crook, and we haven't spoken in a long time. 3, Saddam Hussein, who dreams about genociding me and my people. All three of those people are described often as enemies. And the idea that we are obligated in the same way to A, B, and C strikes me as a little odd. And what I would say, speaking over broadly, is that according to the Jewish tradition, A and B, my rival at work and my slightly crooked cousin, I am obligated to love. The genocidal maniac who wants to kill me and my people, less so. So the Christian New Testament scholar, William Klassen, observes, and I want to quote this, interpreters of Jesus are appropriately united in seeing the commandment to love one's enemy as a normative summary of the attitudes and action of Jesus. Okay? And I think that this is sort of point number 2, that is not a claim you would ever, no one would make the claim about Jewish ethics that a normative summary of Jewish ethics is the obligation to love one's enemies. But as I'll explain in a minute, as a Jewish philosopher, I'm not sure that Jesus's view represents progress. So again, the two pieces here are, number 1, it's not clear that Judaism thinks I have to love every enemy imaginable. I recently asked a prominent Christian theologian in a conversation, I said, just to be clear, you believe that you are obligated by the gospel to love Vladimir Putin, correct? And she said, I have no idea how to do it, but yes. And I said, yeah, well, that's where I think there's probably a divide between how Jewish ethics tends to think and how Christian ethics tends to think. And then also around the issue of loving enemies as a summation of a teaching, I think Judaism tends to be more skeptical for a variety of reasons. I think Judaism tends to be more skeptical. So, for example, first of all, Jews have been somewhat skeptical about how and when it is actually possible to love those who hate us and actively seek to harm us. Second, Jews have wanted to stay sober about the often intractable reality of enmity in the world. So, for example, when an interpreter of Jesus like Robert Funk says, what Jesus is teaching us is that those who love their enemies have no enemies, Jews take a deep breath and wonder whether this is really true and whether it might in fact be irresponsible to think so. More than that, Jews never forget that we do not now live in the peaceable kingdom. Whether we like it or not, the kingdom of God is not in fact at hand, and that there may therefore be times when taking up arms in defense of ourselves and others becomes necessary, not just permitted, but required. I should say, by the way, that of course some Christians think that too, hence the debates about just war theory among Christians. But as Ecclesiastes reminds us, there may even be a time for hate. Now, to be sure, just to be clear, opening the door to the possibility of military conflict makes egregious abuses possible. But shutting the door too tight may lead to inexcusable passivity in the face of genuine evil. It is surely telling, I think, that so many Christian thinkers have felt compelled to mitigate the literal force of Jesus's teaching. That is a really kind of fascinating point as a Jew to watch various Christian ethicists sort of walk back the radical implications of Jesus's insistence on unconditional love of enemies in all circumstances. Fourth and finally, human nature. And I'll try to discuss this briefly. In general, and I am admittedly painting here with a very broad brush, I think it's fair to say that the Christian tradition takes a much dimmer view of human nature than Jewish tradition does. Accordingly, it is far more pessimistic about our capacity to love, to obey the commandment to love our neighbor. I had the experience not long ago. I found this really fascinating. I was reading the commentary on Leviticus by a Christian Bible scholar named Nobuyushi Kiyuchi, in which, commenting on Leviticus 19, he says the following, to me as a Jew, astonishing thing. He says that the meaning of Leviticus 19:18, the mandate to love your neighbor, is that the law, quote, aims to make one aware of and destroy the egocentric and human nature. That's fine, but then comes this. This is achieved by inculcating the realization that one cannot observe this commandment. In other words, we can't actually obey God's law. We can only discover how hopelessly and helplessly mired we are in our own selfishness. When I read Kiyuchi's commentary on Leviticus, I hear not a Bible scholar talking, but a Lutheran theologian importing Luther into Leviticus. Now, it's difficult to imagine any Jewish commentator ever writing a comment like that about the law. On the contrary, if I were to write a commentary on Leviticus, and perhaps I will be accused of importing Judaism into Leviticus here, but I don't think I am, I think I would say the law invites us to consider the possibility that we are capable of more love, more goodness, and more generosity of spirit than perhaps we are usually prepared to imagine. It is not about making us realize how much we can't do, but inviting us to discover perhaps how much, at times at least, we can. In general, I see no evidence at all that the Torah issues commands that it itself assumes we cannot fulfill. For what it's worth, Deuteronomy explicitly states the opposite. This is a quote from Deuteronomy 30, known by heart to most knowledgeable Jews. Surely the instruction, the Torah, which I enjoin upon you this day, is not too baffling for you, nor is it beyond reach. No, the thing is very close to you, in your mouth and in your heart, to observe it. It is not easy to observe the law, but nor, contra Kiyuchi, is it impossible. Now, to be clear, Judaism is hardly Pollyannish about who and what we are. It knows, and Jewish texts never tire of talking about, how often we go astray, embracing what's expedient and self-serving instead of what's right and good, choosing hate or indifference over love. To put this in the best way I know how. The Jewish tradition is not optimistic about human nature, but it is stubbornly, insistently possibilistic. When the great Rabbi Leo Beck describes Judaism as the religion of ethical optimism, I respectfully demur. I think the Jewish tradition is the religion of ethical possibilism. The possibility is there of growing to follow the word of God more than I myself believed myself capable of. So I leave you, in light of these 4 differences, with this very simply. In Judaism and Christianity, we have 2 religions of love. Not surprisingly, given our shared origins, we have a great deal in common, more than either community has ever been willing to admit. But second, as I've tried to show, there are also profound differences between us. Perhaps going forward, we can be committed not to polemics, but to learning from each other and about each other. Perhaps we can finally have enough humility to listen and learn, which is, after all, also profoundly a posture of love.